Good morning, everyone, and welcome on 99 Media. After almost a month from the kidnapping of President Maduro in Venezuela, and in the midst of what looks more and more like a military escalation against Iran, how should we read those geopolitical and economical developments? What are the continuities and differences between Trump's foreign policy and the one of the previous Democratic administration? Well, whilst it's undeniable that many aspects have changed under Trump, it is nevertheless true that when looking for an overarching grand strategy, we can only see that pivot to Asia started by Obama in 2011, which is a euphemism to say confrontation with China and its economic and political allies. We spoke about this with Michael Roberts, Marxist economist from the UK, author of many books, and curator of the blog The Next Recession .wordpress.com. Enjoy the interview. Thank you. All right. So thank you very much, Michael, for being with us again. And today is going to be about Venezuela. And I recently read your article on your blog, The Next Reception, which, by the way, I encourage everybody to follow. And I wanted to ask you, basically following the logic of your paper, starting with Trump's claim that I quote, very large United States oil companies will go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, and start making money for the country. However, you highlight that also many representatives of the very oil companies seem slightly less enthusiastic, to the point that somebody even declared Venezuela uninvestable. So I wanted to ask you, what do you make of these?
Well, if we're looking just at the question of will profits be made out of Donald running Venezuelan oil and getting US oil companies to invest in there to expand production and the revenues to be collected and controlled by the US and by the US companies, I think if we're looking at it on a very narrow basis, that is going to be quite difficult to achieve because for several reasons. Firstly, although Venezuela has the highest amount of proven oil reserves in the world, something like 300 million barrels, it might way bigger than Saudi Arabia, for example. Most of this oil is what they call heavy oil. Therefore, it is not easy to transport. It has to be liquefied. There's quite a lot of technical processes involved to make it possible to export it and sell it in the form. You have to have special refineries for taking heavy oil and so on. Also, a lot of it is in remote parts of Venezuela, which is a huge country, by the way, with huge area in remote parts of the jungle, on the borders of Guyana, which also has potential oil reserves, British Guyana, and that's going to be difficult to transport and so on. And the whole infrastructure of the oil industry in Venezuela has been just collapsed virtually because of sanctions put on by the US imperialism, and also by the inability of Venezuelan to invest enough into new products. They can't get them as well to improve the infrastructure. So it's a massive investment that would be necessary over many years for the US oil companies to start making money out of this. So they're a bit reluctant to do that. And of course, the other factor is that there is a glut of oil in the world now. We see that with relatively slowing growth in economies around the world, there's not quite so much demand for energy growth than it was expected, particularly in fossil fuels. So because there's an increasing move towards renewables and other forms of energy creation, nuclear and so on. And that would mean that oil production and gas production is going to be well above demand for the fossil fuel over the next 10, 20 years. So oil prices have been relatively low. When Trump carried out his kidnapping of Maduro and the establishment of control over the existing regime that's not been replaced, who are now apparently cooperating with Trump, the oil price on Brent was around about $60 a barrel, which is the barest break-even point to make any money out of oil production at the moment. The US has a huge shale oil industry, and at $60 a barrel, most shale oil companies in the US are now losing money. So they're are not in a position to expand production. And if they did, then it comes into competition with any expansion of Venezuelan oil production. So the oil balance, demand and supply balance in the world is not conducive to huge amounts of profit being made, especially when you've got to make lots of investment, maybe $100 billion to turn the Venezuelan oil industry round. So Trump's optimistic, of course. He says he can do it. He's pinched the first $50 million worth of oil revenue and put it in an account in Qatar, which we understand is in his personal name. So that makes an interesting development. But the process of increasing production and revenues in Venezuela is definitely problematic from that point of view. So it raises the question of, is this the only reason that this kidnapping and this takeover of Venezuela behind it? Is it just a question of oil?
Do you see, in following exactly what you were saying, this as a case in which, I mean, also from a, let's say, Marxist theory of the state, you see the state not as a unified actor, but possibly as pursuing different interests. Maybe in this case, there might be a geopolitical move behind Trump's action that doesn't necessarily coincide with the interest of the oil industry. So more of a defensive move to prevent, because I'm thinking also about Iran. So I mean, it's almost openly claimed that there is an attempt of regime change in Iran. There's tweets from the Israeli government officials that say that. So I was thinking, if that move, more than an aim to control in order to actively make profits for their own multinationals, can maybe be seen as a attempt to hit the weaker allies of ultimately China.
I think there's a great deal of merit to that argument, because there's a geopolitical strategy involved here. The Trump administration basically published their geopolitical strategy in the national security document that recently produced from the White House in December, and that outlines a strategy which the Trumpists in the administration are adopting, which is, in their efforts to make America great again, they see geopolitically the question is making the Western Hemisphere quite clearly under hegemonic control by the US, with no competitors, and that includes China, who has been doing a lot of investment into mineral production and oil production in various parts of Latin America, Brazil in particular, but also even in Argentina, where they've put some investments, and oil production to some extent in Venezuela itself. And also Russia, which has looked on supporting Venezuela, so Venezuela can support oil exports to Cuba to keep the Cuban economy going. The US wants to end all that. This is their backyard. The Trumpists are determined, first of all, to take control of any put no opposition in South America and Latin America, starting with Venezuela. I think they'll move on to Cuba later on. We'll see how long Cuba can survive the pressures that are going to be put there. And if the left-wing government of Colombia remains in office after the elections this year, then I think there'll be moves against Colombia as well. So we're seeing a process by which the Western Hemisphere is going to come firmly under the hegemonic control of the Trump administration and the US. They see the Western Hemisphere as not just Latin America, but also Greenland, as we now see, and also Canada even. The whole process of this western side of the Atlantic to the coast of the Pacific is going to be regarded as the position of control for the US. The Monroe Doctrine, which was introduced by the US President James Monroe in 1823 to keep Europe out of Latin America, has now been reintroduced on steroids by Donald. We go from Monroe to Donroe. We have a new system of strategic control by which the US wants. And once they have got that, they then look to the Pacific. They're going to look to the West, towards China, as they see as their main economic and political enemy over the next decade. Not to Europe. The Europeans are to be dumped, sat on, and let them get on with what's going on in Europe. So that is a big geopolitical strategy. It's not entirely, how can I put it, consistent, because Trump seems to jump from all over the place. Whatever he's told he should do, his personality means he cannot be relied on to stick to a consistent strategy. But the underlying process, I think, of this administration is precisely that. Well, that will continue. I think it probably would, but will it continue, say, if the Democrat president is elected in 2028-9, or if the midterms go in the congressional elections at the end of this year to the Democrats? Will that change the policy? I don't think it will, but that's something to be looked at in the future.
Thank you. Changing slightly the topic and focusing more on Venezuela. In your article, you also highlight how, let's say, the Venezuelan economy had some issues which are due to the sanctions, but also on what you defined as an excessive reliance on oil prices. So if I recall correctly, at the beginning of the 2000s, so at the beginning of the Chavez government, which I think started in '99, there was a boom in energy price that allowed basically the sharing of a lot of oil dividends, also improving significantly the livelihood of the population. But then after the oil price collapsed in 2014, there was basically economic crisis that then was made worse by more tariffs and more sanctions. Also, another thing that you mentioned in your article, sorry if this is a bit long, is that you suggest that another reason of the Venezuelan, let's say, difficulty in its economic management was the lack of a concerted national strategy of economic planning, and the persistence of private capital that didn't really play ball in strategic sectors of the government. So it's quite a long question, but I wanted to ask you about this.
Well, when Chavez came to power in the early 2000s, in effect, once he'd overcome attempts of coups to remove him, he adopted a policy where he was going to use Venezuela's oil revenues to improve the conditions of working people in Venezuela. And he was going to take those revenues, and he wasn't going to allow them to be sucked out of the country as under previous administrations to the US and elsewhere, and to fill the coffers of the rich elite in Venezuela. And Chavez made some really important improvements for working people in Venezuela at the time. If you look at it, he introduced free healthcare. He subsidized food and land reform. He reduced poverty levels by a third up to 2005. So extreme poverty diminished from 32% of Venezuelan people to just 19%. And he reduced the general levels of inequality quite sharply. The Gini coefficient, which is often used as a measure of inequality in the country, fell from 45% in 2005, which is pretty high, down to 36%, which made Venezuela the most equal country in the whole of Latin America. But he was only able to do that because he had high oil prices and strong oil revenues, and at that time, no real sanctions being applied by the US on the regime. So he was able to use those to take resources into the hands of the poorer sections of the community. But what he didn't do was actually take over the ownership and control of the big sectors of the economy. Apart from the oil industry, the rest, manufacturing such as it was in Venezuela, land, agricultural production, was still in the hands of the private sector and capitalists, while they were going to be taxed more, much to their complaint. There was no direct control of the whole economy, and therefore a planned investment. So, and also the oil revenues, while they were pushed towards improving the incomes of the poor, were not pushed towards developing an independent industrial strategy of developing manufacturing and investment in Venezuela, which could have been possible. So when the oil price started to fall, as you pointed out in 2014, it also coincided with two other things: the death of Chavez, which his replacement by Vice President Maduro, and also by the introduction of quite strong sanctions by the US from that period from 2014 on. So the whole economic picture for the Maduro regime was completely the opposite, the worst possible environment, and the beginning of the tragedy of Venezuela's decline. All those gains were gradually taken away. The working class support for the Chavista regime dropped away. The Maduro regime became less and less relying and looking towards the working class, and more on the military and the regime to maintain its position. So it lost its social base and became very much separated off and lost a lot of the support of working people, not just the middle classes who are always probably opposed to the Chavistas. So it's a tragedy. It's a combination of the oil price changing, failure to change the economy's basic structure, and also, obviously, the sanctions by US imperialism. I think the lesson here, Carlo, is if you're going to have change in Latin America, which is in the interests of working people in a country in Latin America, it's not good enough just to have political power. It also means you have to change the economic structure of that economy and build an independent national industrial strategy and look to cooperation with other countries in Latin America and elsewhere in order to take that forward. Otherwise, you're going to be isolated. And if you rely just on one commodity, which a lot of South American countries do, whether it's copper, whether it's oil and so on, or whether it's agricultural products in other countries, the danger is that you will not be in a position to change your economy indefinitely, because you are still at the hands of the vagaries of commodity prices and the interference of imperialism.
Yes, thank you very much. So links to this, I was going to ask, so BRICS wasn't really a thing when the bonanza of oil prices that characterized the early 2000s could have allowed for this strategic diversification that you are sort of like referring to, which it has to be said in a context like Venezuela, relies on external capital and technological aid. So maybe they weren't in a position back then to have a support that they might have had just like 10 years later. And linked to this, first of all, if you agree with this sort of like framing, if you see China as a country that is exercising instead a trade and foreign policy and foreign investment policy that is more aimed at allowing for the development of these countries, basically what could be the role of China in the strategy that you were sort of like highlighting before of broader industrial growth rather than relying on a single commodity.
Sure. If we go back to 2000 in Venezuela, China was still emerging as a major economic power in the 21st century. By the time we get to Maduro's accession to power in 2014, it was now a significant factor in the world economy. And of course, we've seen in the last 10 years, even more so, as the Western economies have not progressed very well since the end of the Great Recession in 2009, while China has leapt forward. And China, of course, we know in 2012 adopted the Belt and Road Initiative. What was that about? That was about shifting loads of investment backed by credit into the rest of the world in order to invest and build infrastructure in various parts of the world with emerging market governments in particular in order to develop their economies, but also, of course, in quid pro quo from the Chinese, that they would then have influence over perhaps getting all the resources, the mineral resources, the things that they needed to develop their manufacturing powerhouse that they were developing in China. So China's Belt and Road Initiative was not some just altruistic, we want to help the poor countries. It was about gaining control of important minerals and other resources that they could import back into China and not be reliant upon countries that will be unfriendly, in return for which they have made huge infrastructure projects, investments around the world. In Latin America, the biggest one is a huge automatic port in Peru that's been built, which is transforming the position of Peru's ability to export its copper and other minerals out of the country. So it's in many ways a win-win situation, the Belt and Road Initiative for emerging economies in Latin America. Unfortunately, Venezuela has been too late to take advantage of that because it's now being sucked up by American imperialism. And as we said at the beginning of this discussion, part of the reason for the Venezuela kidnapping and takeover is to stop the further development of Chinese influence in South America. And that's part of that process. So, yes, the BRICS weren't around in 2000. They are around now, but the BRICS is a completely amorphous grouping. I think we should be too optimistic about what it's going to be able to achieve, because if you look at the BRICS, China is really the key factor in the BRICS grouping. China is the force, and American imperialism realizes that. That's why they concentrate on dealing with that. Europe can deal with Russia. Iran is surrounded by Israel and with the American support. India is keeping out of things on its own way, but not interfering internationally particularly. China is the danger for the US.
Okay, I just wanted to ask you one last thing, which is less of an economic question, is more like I think a philosophical one. So in the work of an Italian historian, really, even though I think he also was partially a philosopher, named Domenico Losurdo, great emphasis is put on the material conditions in which socialist projects have taken place. And the concept of socialism under siege, a little bit like in the case of Venezuela, after, especially after, there's this economic crisis and then suddenly more sanctions come. Economic sanctions were a big part in determining the economic difficulties. So I wanted to ask you, isn't this a proof that ultimately a main issue for any country that attempts to develop a socialist project is the fact that it will literally be sieged by imperialists? Like we don't really, I don't think that in the West we fully appreciate what it means to be under sanctions for 40 years. Cuba is probably 60 years. Even Iran. I mean, Iran is clearly not a socialist country, and leftist it would be quite curious to identify with a regime that is based on theocracy. But nevertheless, it's 45 years they've been under sanctions.
Yeah.
And if you want to judge whether a particular country has got a right to self-determine their own situation, we have been actively impeding that from a position of ultimately suprematism. So I wanted to ask you what you think about this, and
is it not to be expected? Imperialism will attempt to crush any possible independent development, particularly one led by the working class, to transform a country and a national economy. It's against their interests. They cannot allow that, and they will attempt in every way they can to stop that and suppress it. When Russia had its revolution in 1917 and established the Soviets, workers' councils, that's what Soviets means, workers' power, not a government led by mullahs and religious people, not a government led by the military, but a working class government for a period of time. Imperialism, 15 countries organized armies, 22 armies to invade Russia during that war in an attempt to crush it militarily, to isolate it economically and so on. And a horrendously difficult period where you talk about sanctions, basically the Soviet Union had horrendous levels of sanctions and blockages to their attempt to develop. Well, how do you overcome that? Well, first of all, you have to recognize that's going to happen, and that you have to mobilize working class organizations to support a government that wants to transform things for working people and to end the control of capitalism in your country. And that won't be enough. You're also going to have to organize support from other countries, from working people in other countries, to give you solidarity and support of that struggle. And that means you need to have the most far-reaching working class democracy operating in such a government so that it's attractive. Process can be seen that if you go forward, it's working people running this, not people, religious people, not military regimes. They are not attractive to working people. You won't get the support from other countries if that's what you're based on. And that's why revolutions which start on the basis of working people, whether it's workers and peasants as well, have some solid international attraction that can take things forward. But if that disappears and sanctions succeed and the repression of imperialism succeeds and the country turns inward and cannot maintain that, then also they lose international support. Revolutions aren't easy. They don't come very often, and they don't necessarily survive. They have to be permanent almost. They have to spread internationally if they're going to be achieved. Venezuela became isolated. Cuba has become isolated. Russia eventually became isolated. At the moment, China is so large that it's not isolated, but it's also under pressure from imperialism. The next 10 years we'll see whether China can develop and spread ideas of a planned economy. The government of China is not particularly interested in spreading international solidarity. It's not a socialist internationalist perspective at all. And that's its danger, that's the risk it faces if it becomes isolated.
All right. Thank you very much. This will probably start a 2 hours long conversation on Marxism, but I think we can leave it for another time. Thank you very much, Michael, and I will nag you again shortly.
Thank you, Carlo.
Thank you very much.
Bye.